Waiting for it to go on air.
We made it. We're live. Apologize. There were some technical difficulties in getting this week's Hangout set up and running, but we are off and running at this point, and the wait will all be worthwhile. Pray. Mark has some really cool stuff in line for us that
very cool.
I hope is worth all the trouble it took to get everybody here.
Yeah.
Matt is once again joining us. So, Mark, why don't you start by introducing yourself real fast? Tell people, why they should listen to you and how long you've been using CanJS and maybe what it is we're going to learn today, and then let you take it from there. And also, for the record, Mark is today my lookalike.
Wait, you're my lookalike.
Nope.
So, my name is Mark Stahl. I work for Batobi since March, which is actually the first time I was introduced to CanJS as well. So that was, I hadn't really done a whole lot of UI programming prior to that for the web. Most of my stuff was spent doing defense contracting. So today what we're going to talk about is, well, actually I'll share my screen and we'll just, let's see, share screen, entire screen, share. All right. Everybody, okay. So can everybody see a table on a table image here?
Everyone says yes.
Okay, everyone says yes. So what we have, and this was a contract that we had where this is part of the application, and this specific instance shows sales amounts, but specifically we also needed to get calculations for previous period, the percent change on that, what the last year was, the percent change, the forecast amount, the percentage achieved of the current sales for the forecast amount, and then the percentage breakdown, which is out of the total, what does each row total up to? What percentage does each row total up to? So I had to basically create a can.Construct that acted in some ways like a single-cell Excel spreadsheet. And so that's what I'm going to be going over today, is basically the code. I had to abstract it, so I'm not going to see running examples today, but we're going to see a lot of comments because that was the important thing here. So, Matt, Chris, you guys good? Everyone else good?
I guess my question would be why I can.Construct. I guess you're going to get into this, but why construct?
No particular reason other than it was a whole lot of JavaScript, and it was just an easy way to make an abstraction.
But you're not going to do, it doesn't need to be control, you're not going to manipulate the DOM or anything with this?
No, because what we ultimately ended up doing was having a view layer, a view model there, that the values coming back from these, when their data would get updated, they would update the individual cells in that table that I showed you in the image.
All right. So
this is basically this image is a template backed by a whole bunch of these can.Constructs, and we were under a deadline. So, what was that?
I would say too, Mark. Sometimes the most helpful things I've ever seen on these Hangouts is when one person shows the way that they went about building something, and then Matt and myself can kind of say maybe how we would have built it differently. So,
exactly, because this was written under duress, for lack of a better terminology. We had to get it done very quickly, so there's probably some choices here that were not the best. And those pieces of advice would be fantastic. So can everybody see do I need to increase the font size?
Maybe a little bit. That's pretty good.
Yeah, that's good to me.
Good there? Okay. So basically what we're going to do here is just show two examples from that table of the image. So we had the current sales, which was the first column here, the sales amount column, and then the previous period percent change. And the interfaces that we're going to use here are really simple. We have the base series, which is this construct that we're going to look at, and you provide it a query object, which would just be your request parameters. And I'll get into why it was done this way soon as we get down into the code. The data request function is all of the logic that you would actually do to perform a request would go in here, passing in the query. And then most of the time you are going to end up formatting it. So in this instance, we're just going to say it's a format of number. And then the additions, one of the reasons, by the way, Matt, to answer your question now that I remember, is the can.Construct was to also specialize the query. So we could create children series, as I'm doing here, and not have to re-specify all the rest of the parameters. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think so. So it's when you say request, what do you mean, like an Ajax request?
Like yes, a server request. So the data request function here performs a server request.
Okay.
And the reason that we did this is that each one of the columns that I showed you is actually a different query to the server. So the backend doesn't wrap all that up for the specific instance. So provided an interface for the user to get the query, depend on another series, which is what you can see at line 17 here. So we're depending on the instance of current sales. Specialize the query, validate the query, and then relate the values, which is a function where you would relate the data of the depends on object to the current data, which is where you start basically, if you think about an Excel spreadsheet, when you start to call out A1, B2, etc. in your computation, that's what the relate values function is for, and it depends on property. And then all of this stuff gets updated with one simple call, which is just updating the query on the original, the current sales amount query, and then everything else falls out. And I'll show you how that occurs. We're going to skip a lot of the properties that are associated here. I linked the gist in the chat, in the Q&A area, so that if people wanted to look at the code.
Very cool.
And that would make it easier if I talk about some things more than others. People can look at the rest of the code as well, or if I skip some things. So the core of this entire thing is that when one of the dependent series updates its data, or a parent of a given series updates a property, we want to do other actions. And this is where this is the data flow aspect. So if my parent updates my query, the child should perform a query all over it, perform a request all over again, and do the specialization and the validation. If a dependent series updates the data, well, then I need to reevaluate the relate values and potentially do a different request. So that's what this entire thing is based off of. If the core column changes anything about it, the rest of the columns will follow suit. So that's what this mapping is. This is the first mapping, lines 131 through 147. Basically what we're saying here is if myself or my parent updates the query, specialized query, or validate query properties, we're going to perform all of the requesting operations all over again, as well as the specialization and validating the queries. Then there's also post-processing events, which could be format, depends on, post-process, and relate values. And the post-process property, by the way, is to turn a given response data into a format that you actually want to deal with inside the relate values function. All right. Is everyone still with me?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay.
Interesting.
The core, the most operable part of this entire thing is this.depends.on data event being captured and the callback associated with it. Because this means that when this is what occurs when our current sales series updates, all of the rest of the dependent series update as well from these few lines.
Okay. I was going to ask how that works. That's neat.
So that's why there's no request function to call or anything like that. You merely update properties, everything else is taken care of. So when we actually go through, let's actually walk through, and I'll show you how these properties interleave with each other. So when we let's say we're the child series, so we're looking at previous period change. The current series does a new request, it gets data, so I'm going to end up doing a request myself so I can do some calculations. So when I update myself, trigger the property, and end up getting into this block of code here, which is my query property had changed, so now we want to actually validate the query and go through all of the processes of, or all of the steps of the process. So after we validate it, then we're actually going to do the request data and the post-processing. Okay, so first thing that we're going to do is validate, which the specialized query. Specialized query is basically a call to whatever function that you specified as a property. So what this was used for was, if we have a current sales period from a start date to an end date, and we need the previous period, then what we want to do is take the current period and modify its dates, its start date and end date. Does that make sense to everyone? Okay, I assume it does by silence.
Yeah, it does.
Okay, I can't see your guys' face because I'm looking at it. So after specializing, then we can also, if we wanted to, validate that query by providing a function to the property validate query. And where we ran into a problem with this and why this came about was we had to validate across the fiscal calendar, which would, let's say, using something like Moment.js, is not going to necessarily work because your month boundaries don't fall on a calendar month. Your week boundaries may start from a different date. So we had to do validation on the UI before we would even do a request. So after we specialize a query, we want to validate the query. And after we're done validating the query, we're actually going to do the request. This is going to use the request data function that you provided. And it's very simple. It has to take one argument and ultimately return a deferred. That's it. And that will give us back whatever response data is in there, because what we'll subsequently call is the post-processing. The post-processing will take whatever was returned from the server and change it into a data format that you want to work with. And we had to deal with that as well because we had to pull certain properties off. So after the request is called, we call post-process, and this is also provided by the user. Post-process will then, during that entire process, we'll call relate values. And this is where the kicker happens. So I'm going to actually scroll back up to the screen, or you can look at the comments in the beginning of the file. I made notes in here about relate values. So a previous period calculation is the relate values function is going to loop over the depends on data. And inside the context, you're going to have a this.data property. So your current data is going to be in context, and you're going to loop over an individual item out of the depends on series. So a previous period percent change may look something like this, where it's the previous period item minus the current period item divided by the previous period item. And you're going to end up returning that. And that will all get collected into the data property of the series. And after we end up relating all of the values, we're going to then finish post-processing them, which is to end up formatting them. So what you're going to end up having is whatever object you set up in the post-process function, we're going to add a property called formatted to it. So you'll get the raw data value and you'll get the formatted data value so that you can either do computation or you can display. And all you have to do to end up using this is, since we extend this series with can event, is basically do, let's say the instance is called current, so you could do current.on and then the data property, because we will update data and it will throw an event, and then everything else from the rendering side can fall out from there, and you can update your view model. And that was a really, really quick explanation through this entire thing. So What kind of questions or confusions or suggestions would everybody else have?
I kind of missed part of it there at the end. Did you consider doing a model?
We did not consider doing a model.
Or just a map, perhaps?
No. And I don't necessarily why, I don't have a good explanation as to why those weren't necessarily validated, other than inside my head I knew how I could write this really quick.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think what I would be concerned with, the map would work. What I'd be concerned with, and this is because of my lack of understanding of the intricacies of models, would be how would I be able to say this model depends on this model,
right?
And so when I get data from one, do the request for another, and then perform a computation to get a value out that's dependent on both of them.
Yeah, you might be able to do that as like a plug-in or something. Kind of similar to how you implemented it, actually, by firing an event or something.
Right.
Yeah, that'd be a kind of cool plug-in to do for models.
And there was, I talked to a friend about this whole thing, and although I I likened it to an Excel spreadsheet or a single cell of an Excel spreadsheet, the one thing that I want to add to it is that it doesn't have the ability to take on multiple depends on objects. So there's only one depends on object, where what would be really nice is to have more like an Excel spreadsheet where you can have multiple cells that are referenced in there, and that relate values would iterate and pass in those arguments. The problem with that, of course, was that assumes that you have a normalized set of data coming back from each one of those depends on values. Like, they're all the same count, et cetera, et cetera.
Why does it depend on that?
So if I have, because I was thinking about basically jagged collections, and I could, from one series, I could get 20 items out of. From another series, I could get 10 items out of. So when I'm looping through and providing arguments, how can I make sure that those all line up to be correct? It's basically what the problem I saw.
Awesome.
Chris, well, actually, Matt, do you have any suggestions about, I mean, or is there questions, since you missed part of it, was there questions concerning the post-processing?
Well, what I guess I didn't see, how do you unbind from all these events that you're listening to?
Well, these actually stay around. So we keep this, when we instantiate the series, we actually hold on to them, and then we just update the properties on them itself. So they actually get cleaned up when, let's say, their parent control or whatnot would be cleaned up.
Okay.
If not, we hold on to them for the lifetime of the application. Instead of instantiating them over and over again. And there is means to basically set like the result to null and updating the data to an empty array so that we don't have stale data, since we keep these series around for the lifetime of the application.
Okay, can you explain related values again real quick?
Sure. And let me actually, I'm a consummate commenter in code, so.
I saw that.
Okay, and so there's obviously, since it is kind of confusing, I have a really long paragraph here about it. So the relate values function is provided by you as the user, and it takes one argument and has two values in its context. It has a this.data and it has a this.query, which are the data and the query of the current series that you're on. The one argument that is coming in.
Wait. Do you say that relate values is a function that returns an object with those properties?
No,
it has it itself.
It has those two properties on its this.
Okay.
It's so in context.
Gotcha. Okay.
And the argument coming in is a single element of the depends on data. So basically what is happening is where I'm iterating over the depends on data, passing that into the function, and then generally what we did in the application was that you would look up the ID in your current data to map the two up. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And then you perform your computations and return a value because we end up collecting that out of the relate values function. So that becomes a new data array that has these computed values in them.
Sorry, I'm just reading.
Okay.
I'm not reading your implementation of it.
And I could point you, actually, if you, so the relate values thing starts at 237.
Okay.
Hey, Mark, I'm just like a little bit more of a high level for everybody watching. What would you say, like, what things would you say you learned the most about CanJS? What was the biggest pros and cons you ran into when building this out? Like, how did CanJS help you? Something you might have struggled with before, made something cooler or easier.
The can event plugin was a lifesaver
Mm-hmm.
in the sense that I didn't have to worry about polling an object to see if it had data. I didn't have to worry about returning deferreds and then having callback hell. I could literally I could instantiate a series, and then I could just wait for a given event to be thrown, and that would update the rest of my view model, which is nice because what it from my standpoint of view, there are arguments on frameworks. Frameworks in general give you a lot of stuff built in, but this specific instance, because the application was so specific, I really needed to just be able to do it myself and throw any events that I wanted to throw and tweak it. And the simplicity of the combination of construct and can event were fantastic.
Very cool. Anything else? Or any other questions, Matt, for...
No, just I agree with Mark in general. The can event is great. We need to have more like mix-inable kinds of stuff like that.
And it was so nice just to be able to do that in one line of code, like can.Extend,
Yep.
thing with can event, done, end of story.
Yep.
And all of a sudden I was able to throw events. It was wonderful coming from prior to this job, coming from worlds like .NET and Java and whatnot. Something as simple as that to do was amazing.
Mm-hmm. You don't have to have an interface and
Exactly.
and all that.
But obviously you can see that background because I basically wrote a class.
Yeah.
Hey, Mark, also we got a question from Steven. It says, why use can.Construct over can.Component, manually binding the view without live bindings, etc.? So, Steven, I don't know if you're at the very beginning, but Matt kind of asked the same question, but maybe Mark can dive a little bit more into it. Matt, maybe now that you've kind of started with the same question, where you can help shed some light.
So the cop-out answer was that we had to do this very quickly, so I knew how to write it very quickly. The technical side of this would be there were things that we had to do in the UI that I felt were not relevant to the processing of the request data. For example, there's a requirement that we hide a given row if all of the values are 0. Not if sales amount is 0, but if sales and previous year and previous period and forecast were all zeros, hide that row. So we basically staged how we did the viewing and the rendering of the view model. So request the data first, and then perform yet another action or another set of operations where we could look at the data that we got back and decide what we were going to do with it and how we were going to render it. So it was more about a control issue.
Yeah, it's probably much more performant doing that rather than like listening to every row and seeing when its value change and then hiding them all based off of that.
That could be, and I wish that was actually a concern, but it wasn't.
Okay.
And then, Mark, I actually just shot you the next question too from Adam. This one's definitely more of a specific question. It says, why use the context this for data in query and not just pass in all three as arguments, like function, the first argument, item, data, query? If you see, I just sent it to you on our HIP chat, but it might be a little easier for you to answer if you can see the question.
I was just gonna say, yeah. Let me launch it up let me launch up HipChat. Okay, send it to me. Why use context this for data and query and not just pass in all three as arguments?
Why not?
That's also a good question. So what I was trying to make work was multiple. When I originally wrote this, I was trying to make multiple depends on objects pass in their data as arguments. So you could imagine if you had multiple depends on objects, you would want to have n number of arguments in your function. So if you have 3 depends on objects, you want to have 3 functions for your arguments. And I felt that was very explicit. I didn't necessarily want to pass in the data itself because it was just a symmetry. It was a taste thing. There was no technical reason for it. It was purely taste. The other side, it could be argued, though, was that the order that the data is getting returned was not always the same. So just like you would request from a database, you could get them in different orders. So if I was to iterate over both my series and the depends on series data, it's not guaranteed that those IDs are going to line up. And now, mind you, I could have ordered them by ID both and then sent them in, but we didn't do it that way. So I don't have a good answer for you, actually.
And then other than that, there's no other questions from anybody. Thank you guys for asking the questions.
Yes.
I would personally say, like, I think the coolest thing about this talk is, usually everybody hits the very popular, the very well-known high-level areas of CanJS, like components, models, route, etc., which is great because that's stuff 90% of people need most of the time. But I think it was really great to have you talking about can event and can.Construct and just showing people there are a lot of these great tools that were kind of in a way built to allow us to build CanJS, to build can component, to build can models. We have a lot of these other low-level utilities in CanJS, and it's good to hear you actually talking about using them, and hopefully kind of bring some light to other people so they can start using them too. Look into those other options. Especially in a lot of ways from a developer who is not from the world of web programming. I'm not. I come from a back-end world, a server-side development, and so this was a nice transition for me. Like, I could easily refresh a template based on data that I got out instead of, in one instance, I could have spent time figuring out all the stuff that I wanted to do using a component or using even a control. But this just ended up being easier based on the requirements and my background to quickly put something together. And also ends up being a little reusable in some fashions.
Mm-hmm.
Cool. But other than that, unless you guys have any questions or anything else you want to say, we're going to call it a day. Thank God it's Friday. Woo! And I'm leaving on vacation for the next 2 weeks, which will be amazing.
2 weeks?
Yep. So I think Matt is going to probably be taking over as host. Say hi, Matt.
Okay.
I will treat you all well. Big Matt turned red. So I'm going to have a great trip, and you guys have great hangouts, and I can't wait to watch it when I get back. So have a great one, and au revoir. See you guys later.
Au revoir.